Started. Good evening. Welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live virtual event with Dr. Alessio Fasano, the co-author of Gut Feelings. Before we begin, just as a reminder, you can register and view a list of all of our upcoming programs at hudsonlibrary.org. Next month, we will be welcoming Al Roker and Aaron Brockovich. So check out those programs. You should be able to register for those now. And of course, as many of you already know, we do welcome questions at any time during the discussion. Just type your question into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. And we do have some built-in time in the presentation for questions. So I hope you do have lots of questions for today's presenter. It's a privilege to introduce tonight's guests. We actually have two guests, a special night for you. We have, of course, Dr. Alessio Fasano, and we're also fortunate to welcome Susan Flaherty, the book's co-author, who will also be joining us for the Q&A discussion at the end. Dr. Fasano is the W. Allen Walker Chair of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition and Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Celiac Research and Treatment at Massachusetts General Hospital. An award-winning writer and editor, Flaherty is the director of communications at the Center for Celiac Research and Treatment at Massachusetts General Hospital. Please join me in welcoming our guests tonight. Thanks for being here. You're on, you can share your screen.
All right, so evening everybody. Really appreciate the time that you're taking this beautiful night, at least here in Boston, to join us. And I'm gonna very informally chat a little bit about this work of love and heart. There's been this book that Susie and I embarked a few years ago. We didn't know what we signed up for. Little we knew that, you know, this book would take so much of our effort and commitment and dedication. But I have to say that after many years of work, due to the challenge of the topic, because we're talking about the microbiome, something that is a really hot topic nowadays, that it's a very dynamic field. So by the time that we finished to write the chapter, was already, I will not say obsolete, but there were new information needs to be added, and therefore we have to go back and forth many, many times, and yet respect the publisher deadline to finish and wrap it up everything by a certain time in order that the book can come out as it did, this week. And then another curveball happened while we were doing this. There was, the COVID-19 pandemics. They changed completely the landscape of our lives, and including this book. And so we had to, at the very last minute, rush with some, new addendums and changes to really make the book, as updated as possible. Ultimately, Susie and I have been wrapping up this project, and I believe that we both are extremely satisfied with the outcome. Just out of the bat, I have to say that this project would not have, see the light of completion without the mind of many colleagues and friends that, provided their strong expertise to help us really to make this book, a complete landscape and also inspiration for what we believe is going to happen in the near future in terms of the study gut microbiome and how this will impact on our health. Why we did this? Well, because we, at the center where we work, at the Center for Celiac Research and Treatment, where we work on not only in celiac disease, but a variety of chronic inflammatory diseases, we appreciate that there is a clear change of the paradigm why some people on a specific genetic background develop disease and others they do not. And again, the inspirational beginning of the story was this hygiene hypothesis that I'm not going to go too much in details. It's suffice to say that our species during the entire 2 million years evolution have been really suffering, but only one problem when it comes to morbidity and mortality, and they were infectious diseases. That's the main reason why we used to get sick and then die with the average surviving age of 50, 55 until really the recent past. We're talking about less than a century ago. And then everything was revolutionized in the recent, 50 years or so, when we appreciate a little bit more about the word of the microorganisms, so much so that, science like infectious disease and the bacterial pathogenesis and viral infection became more and more clear to us. As with that, of course, came also the remedies, the antibiotics, the vaccines, and so on and so forth. So for countries, particularly living in the Western Hemisphere, the advent of these new tools completely changed the landscape of the burden of infectious disease on humankind. You see on the left, this plummeting, frequency of many of the infectious diseases that plague our human history. So by the time that we again developed vaccine and had antibiotics, diseases like rheumatic fever, mumps, measles, hepatitis A, TB, and polio, it just dropped completely, almost down to the ground. But during the same time, and in a parallel way, there was a steep increase of non-infective chronic inflammatory diseases, including including allergies, autoimmune diseases, and so on and so forth. And again, the major discrepancy that we see in this kind of epidemiological landscape is that this was a premise of people that embrace the Western lifestyle. And beside that, we saw the same many autoimmune diseases. This is an example, for example, a celiac disease that double every 15 years. Interesting, natural, experiments happen in China, where rather than in 5 decades, in only 10 years, they moved from a rural, poor economy to a global economy that resembled the Western, hemisphere. And in that 10 years, they catch up, very fast when it comes to, chronic inflammatory diseases, including food allergies in this case. And we see this, again, with inflammatory bowel disease and so on and so forth. But because inflammation is the common denominator in many diseases, we see the same trend for cancer. So we see the explosion of some cancers, again, in relatively short period of time, that, really been impacting the reason why we got sick and we die now if we will live a Western lifestyle. Maybe that the most impactful example of this steep, epidemics is, the example of autism, that in only a quarter of a century, we moved from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 58. And if you consider that the male-female ratio, it's 4 to 1, that means the next generation, 1 boy out of 4 will be out of commission because of autism. So clearly, this is something that is teaching us several lessons. First of all, the old paradigm, genes plus environment, they are necessary, sufficient to develop this disease, doesn't need pin anymore. And the second thing is that, again, this is a too short period of time to blame the gene mutations to be responsible for this, ballooning, frequency of these conditions. So if we look at this phenomenon that I just explained right now with a negative, pessimistic point of view, the conclusion is, well, we are, changing the environment too fast for us to adapt. And what is said, I have to say that within these epidemics in the Western Hemisphere, there are some groups that pay the dearest price, particularly minorities, the people that are socioeconomically in disadvantage. And history repeats itself because there is always somebody that paid the highest price. And this is the case also for these conditions. However, if we look at the same phenomenon and we interpret this with a more positive attitude, what this epidemic in such a short period of time is teaching us is that if we're genetically predisposed to develop any of these diseases, it's not a destiny that we develop it. It really depends how we play our genetic cards. So in other words, there are lifestyle that seems to protect against this acceleration of, these chronic inflammatory diseases, and others that seems to really prevent that. So the key elements at this point is really to understand what we did wrong to fuel this quote unquote epidemics of these conditions, and what we can do to mitigate, if not prevent, this acceleration, so that the goal that we're trying to achieve, to live longer lives, will be parallel also by the quality of life. Because living longer but chronically sick is not a good paradigm. It will be much better to live a longer life but healthier life, so that we can stay independent for a long period of time. So that led to a revisitation, also thanks to studies that involve the Human Genome Project and so on and so forth. That yes, genes and environment are absolutely necessary, still play a major role, but they're not sufficient. There is something else that needs to come into the picture for this switch from genetic predisposition to clinical outcome. And there are at least another 3 elements. One is the loss of these barriers that we have in our body to prevent these 2 worlds, genes that live in our body and the environmental factor that can make us sick, that normally are kept at bay, so that they don't encounter each other, starting the march toward the inflammation and therefore disease. And this is due to changes in, for example, permeability of these barriers, the largest being the intestine, so gut permeability seems to be playing a major role. The 4th element is definitely an immune system that becomes hypervigilant. So that this chronic inflammation implies that there is a stated inflammatory process that is exaggerated, inappropriate, that we suffer, that will be the common denominator of these conditions. And of course, pertinent to this book, the last, definitely not the least, but really the last kids in the block, is this quote unquote parallel civilization, this wealth of microorganisms that we co-evolve with, that can really dictate a lot of this way that we play our genetic cards. Because there is a clear crosstalk, because we co-evolve with this microorganism. I want to remind everybody that they appeared during evolution way before that human species, made its, advent on a stage, and therefore we've been forged, whatever we are as a species, also because we were meant and been engineered to coexist with this wealth of microorganisms, for which there is a daily exchange of information that can really, from what we understand now, dictate if and when, why, and how genes that put us at risk for any kind of disease that will be turned on or will be kept off. So that brought to another shift of paradigm that we put forward a long time ago. When the Human Genome Project was completed, that we realized that genetically speaking, we're rather rudimental. We are made only by 23,000 genes. The premise, if we resolve the human genome, we have the key to resolve all diseases, because the paradigm was 1 gene, 1 product, meaning 1 protein, 1 disease, and turns to be incorrect. And now, the understanding is that, the human genome is still extremely important, because that dictates our predisposition to develop diseases. But even more important for some aspects is the microbiome, this wealth of genes produced by the microorganisms that can really impinge on our genome and can decide indeed if we will stay healthy or not. The human genome, of course, doesn't change. With rare gene editing that we're trying to do for single gene mutation for rare diseases, once you got that genome, you can't change it. You can't trade it in. But the way that this genome will translate in health or disease, that now we have the beginning of understanding that we can. We can through the manipulation of the microbiome, because the microbiome, contrary to the human genome, is extremely dynamic, change in individual over time, and is different from one individual to another. So if you allow me a sort of parallel, assuming that the human genome is a sort of piano with 23,000 notes, 1 for each gene. And let's say that to play the song Alzheimer, you have to strike 300 these notes. It really depends on the piano player if you will play that song or not. And the piano player is indeed the microbiome. So if you have, Elton John that will play, pop music and will touch, 200, 300 notes, there is no song, Alzheimer or multiple sclerosis, that will be played. But something happened to us. We change the lifestyle. We do something, in other words, wrong, that will change the microbiome composition. Now Chopin, it is a virtuoso, sits on the piano, touch all 300 notes, and now, we switch from genetic predisposition to clinical outcome. Once again, if these paradigms hold true, that means that there is no destiny, that we have to develop these conditions. If we know how we can maintain a friendly relationship, a symbiotic relationship with our microbiome, chance exists that we will be able, as the overall, paramount goal, to intercept these diseases and prevent that to happen. Or if we already have, these diseases because we've been affected by them, we have a more personalized way to treat them in a more gentle and appropriate way, rather than just with drugs that may not work. Again, why you should read this book? Because we are at the dawn of a revolutionary change of our understanding in terms of, our physiology, our pathology, how this will, translate on a clinical ground, not only the single individual, but entire populations. And I'm going to finish up by giving an example about this, that can be affected by the way that we exchange with each other, the microbiome, and eventually the symbiotic relationship that we may, facilitate or we can lose depending on lifestyle. And again, while we talk about the microbiome, I want to make clear that this is, a concept that takes, out of the equation another important aspect to be considered. We are part of a bigger universe, so to speak, that includes our atmosphere, the soil, the waters, and so on and so forth. So if we pollute, if we have, global warming, this will affect the microbiome in other environments. And when this microbiome will eventually colonize us, we'll have tremendous negative consequences. So it's not just our body needs to be taken care of, it's the environment where we live, thrive, we raise our kids and so on and so forth, because there's always an exchange, sort of circle life, if you wish, that needs to be protected in order to stay healthy. Again, I don't want to go in these details, but what you're going to learn, in this book, that the microbiome is made by a lot of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, archaea, parasites, and yeast, and so on and so forth. There is at least a ratio 1-to-1 between our own cells and the cells of the microbiome, but they generate 150 times more the genes that we do. They do a lot of good things for us. If we establish a friendly relationship, the microbiome will help us to scavenge energy from food, from component of food that we cannot make use of because we don't have the enzymes to take care of the digestion and absorption of these nutrients. Regulates a lot of metabolic functions that can indeed impinge on our state of health or disease. Produce essential vitamins. Of course, regulate the immune system, so we'll eventually shape an immune system that's more protective than harmful against ourselves. And finally, a good microbiome will protect us against the bad guys, the bad pathogens. After all, penicillin is nothing else than a substance produced by bacteria to kill another one. But again, genetically we are different, and therefore our microbiome, to be ideally working in friendly relationship with us, is also very different from one individual to another. So this comes in this other concept of personalization of the microbiome human-host relationship to have a friendly symbiotic relationship. And again, during evolution, we spend a lot of time to find the sweet spot to choose each other, to choose the right microbiome that is compatible with our genetic makeup. And this has been based on the way they were evolved, i.e. to be born by vaginal delivery, to be fed, breast milk, to not have exposed to antibiotics because they didn't come until the recent past, to be fed the right stuff, and so on and so forth. Anything anything that perturbs this plane of evolution will have tremendous negative consequences in finding each other in this friendly relationship, and therefore increase our chance really to take the wrong turn and switch the genetic predisposition in the clinical outcome. So this wisdom of microbiology species is the first part of the book in which we talk about this evolutionary existence between us, the microbiome, the ancient microbiome, how this has been changing over time, why we see this more in the Western hemisphere, that is the one that more dramatically changed the way that we evolved compared to developing countries, that they still have a lifestyle that resemble, what we used to have in the past, and so on and so forth. We believe, Susan and I, that this was an essential part to, set the stage, to give the foundation now to appreciate what could be the consequences and the eventual role of the microbiome in a variety of diseases. And again, if I have to go through the list of what we wrote here, well, we will spend, the rest, the time just to go to the list of diseases. Suffice to say that we decide to take some examples in which we have more robust evidence of the role of the microbiome in causing diseases. And, you name it. As I told you, there are allergic disease, neurodegenerative disease, autoimmune disease, aging. Aging is part of, changing the microbiome. As we also know, age is something that we cannot avoid. We all will age. But there are people that age very graciously and people that do not. And it seems that, the way that we age, if we stay active, if we stay, healthy and so on and so forth, strongly depends on how we take care of our microbiome. And the final part is to maintain the microbiome, in a state of health, to maintain a state of health. In other words, what we can do in terms of intervention, if there is a derailment of a friendly microbiome because of some of these elements that increase the risk for us to have an imbalanced microbiome, what we call dysbiosis, what we can do in terms of intervention to reshape the microbiome to bring back to a state of health. I have to say that this is a very futuristic, because despite what you read in the literature or in the magazines, or even worse on internet, we are still at the crawling and start to walking, learning process in the microbiome. We are not running quite yet. And therefore, anybody that say we have a solution with this intervention that can be this probiotic, this prebiotic, and so on and so forth, we're not quite there yet. We will, but because, as I mentioned before, the microbiome is so personalized, there is not a single remedy to fix them all. There is a key element of understanding that we're still trying to make a sense of, that is in this book explained very clearly, in which paradoxically we can be all genetically different, we can always all have a different microbiome, but the metabolic outcome, the ones that ultimately decide if we stay healthy or not, it's very similar when it comes to specific metabolic function that will dictate the state of health versus disease. And that is the premise, to find the right intervention to eventually maintain a healthy microbiome. I'm not going to go through this other than give you an example, because this is so tangibly important right now, that all elements that can dictate the composition and function of the microbiome in terms of environmental factor, by far, food is the most important. There are people that are exposed to pollution, people that are exposed to antibiotics, that have been born by C-section, by vaginal delivery, but these are point, cases, point, events. We all eat 3-4 times a day, and therefore, by far, the most impactful elements that can shape the microbiome is nutrition. And you will read, and I don't know if this will come as a surprise to you, that the main reason why people get sick and die nowadays is not cancer, is not infectious disease and so on and so forth, is nutrition. Nutrition is the most impactful factor that dictates if we got sick or die. And you see in this map worldwide, that has been a review of millions of people in the past decades, the darker and the hotter is the air, the more is the impact of morbidity and mortality due to nutrition. How we have all paying a price, particularly, again, in the northern and the western hemisphere, of the impact of nutrition due to change of the shape of the microbiome. And interestingly enough, if you see the list of the reason why, the nutritional habits and that will increase our risk of morbidity and mortality, if you take the first, reason, the most frequent one, high, low sodium, that of course increases the blood pressure and therefore increase the cardiovascular disease and so on and so forth. And there I can even make an argument. The vast majority of the rest are all issues that are related to a negative impact on the microbiome. So if we have a diet poor in fibers, in fruit and vegetable, in nuts, in omega-3 fats, and so on and so forth, they all impact, the microbiome in a negative way. And the one that you see, in that square there is also very socioeconomically driven. Poor people are the ones that pay the highest price again, because these are the, nutrition habits that unfortunately are not available to people that have to feed their family on a $3-4 a day kind of budget. And this happened to be, by the way, the typical nutrition of the Mediterranean diets, because it's based on this kind of nutrients. I'm going to finish up to say, look, we are in the midst of a pandemic. This has been a tremendously impactful, elements that remind us that maybe that we don't die of infections anymore, but once in a while, Mother Nature comes back and wants to remind us that if you don't respect, again, the environment as a whole, we will pay a dear price, even for infectious disease that this time, once again, is showing us that if we don't have a prepared microbiome to help us to fight this kind of events, we succumb. For example, again, I hate to put these numbers up there, but this it's a travesty that we have lost so many lives. Almost 3 million people died worldwide because of this pandemic, of which more than 500,000 here just in the United States. Who are the ones that succumb to all this? Are the people with obesity, metabolic disorder, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, other preconditions, of course, elderly, and so on and so forth. And what is the common denominator of these people? These are people that have metabolic disturbances due to inappropriate nutrition that impact the microbiome in such a negative way that when it comes to fight infections, we are not prepared because our immune system now is playing this game in disadvantage because it's not guided correctly by a healthy microbiome. And again, you see now the Mediterranean diet pyramid that I put here as an example, in which, in general, the food pyramid, they have at the basis, what you eat the most, and the top we eat the least. But at the base of the Mediterranean, diet pyramid, there is no food. It's lifestyle. Just to remind us, food is important, but lifestyle, play outside, grow elderly together, having family time, don't be too stressed out, having good sleep hygiene. These are all elements that keep us healthy. And guess what? They all impinge on the function of the microbiome that will be instrumental to stay healthy. So these are consequences that are embraced and implanted very early in life, with the famous first 1,000 days of life from conception until 2 years of age. That's the time in which we find the sweet spot to live in a symbiotic relationship with our microbiome. If we play that game correctly, we will live longer and healthier life. If we do not, we will pay consequences way down the road during our entire lifespan, years and years after that. So that's the reason why healthy lifestyle, healthy nutrition, balanced microbiome will be instrumental to really achieve this goal. Gut Feeling, this book here, again, is a work of love from Susie and I that really summarize and expand of some of the concepts that I just told you, that, for the readership that can be, the person that knows the ins and outs of the microbiome and wants to really see the state of the art of the science where we stand right now, all the way to the other spectrum of people that heard microbiome for the first time, but want to know how can I play my genetic cards the best play possible to stay healthy, will be a useful, readership. So I thank you for taking the time tonight to listen a little bit to this presentation, this book. We're very excited about it. I want to say that, whatever will be the revenues of this book will all go 100% back to research so that we can expand even more our knowledge and help us to help you to stay healthy and to stay, safe and well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Fasano. And while you guys are, I want to remind everyone, please put in your questions. We already have some coming in. We're going to spend the rest of the time. Dr. Fasano has agreed to answer all of your questions, but I do want to mention, because I was so excited to get to the speaker, that this book is available for purchase from the Learned Owl bookstore. And if you look in our chat window, we have a link for that purchase. So let me open some questions. We've got, are you familiar with James Hamblin, MD's book Clean? If so, what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not only familiar with that, but I also am familiar with many other books, that they're through and so on and so forth. I think that, again, the hygiene hypothesis has been evolving a little bit further than the old concept. It is true, of course, that you have to clean it for your own goods. You avoid to get infected with something, but you pay a price because, again, you don't allow your immune system to be trained to fight, infections, and therefore you're more susceptible. And again, this is the old concept of the hygiene hypothesis. I believe that now we have to shift more, because we know more, on the concept of the microbiome hypothesis, in which, of course, if you live in a farm, you live together with the animals, you put your hands in the dirt, of course, your hygiene is decreased, you increase your chance to get, get infected. But we know well that these are the folks that they have less chances and less frequently affected by allergic diseases, to be frequently sick with, flu and that kind of stuff. Now, the question is, what is the right needle to really eventually get the chance to, have an immune system guided by the microbiome that keep us healthy, but at the same time will not increase our chance to get, infections. And see what happened now with COVID-19. We have a huge number of people that they died, but could be much more if we didn't implement it, the hygiene with washing hands very frequently and so on and so forth. So should we do this for the rest of the life? Probably not, but right now this is necessary. But this is taking just one piece of a much more complex puzzle that, again, we hope to detangle with this book, to say it's more than the clean, it's more than the dirty, it's a little bit more complicated. And again, it takes a more holistic and general vision of the story, as I was telling you before, taking care of the environment. Because, it's not that we got our microbiome stays with us. Once we, eliminate, stools, for example, that microbiome goes back in the environment. And then it's going to go in the soil, and the soil is going to be in the water, and the water is going to be in the air. And this will come back to us through animals, water, and so on and so forth. So if we don't take the care of the entire ecosystem and just focus on our hygiene, we will make a disservice to what will be the goal, to try to understand what we did wrong to fuel this, epidemics, and what we should do to fix it.
Okay. You had brought up COVID, and somebody asked, my doctor theorizes that long haul COVID is caused by inflammation. What do you think about this?
No question about that. Any kind of infection, including a viral infection with SARS-CoV-2, will have a fertility rate if you have a chronic inflammatory situation. Said that, there have been studies that prove clearly that if you are affected by an autoimmune disease, for example, the chance to contract, COVID is the same as the general population. But by the same token, if you have a chronic inflammation that is ongoing, poorly controlled, and therefore you have the immune system fight an enemy that is your chronic inflammatory condition, now there are less soldiers, i.e. less immune system cells that can fight the newcomer, in this case, the SARS-CoV-2. And this is one reason why we believe that people with this kind of condition were most susceptible to get infected, to have serious consequences, to have prolonged SARS-CoV-2 infection, and eventually end up in the intensive care units and unfortunately die of the infection.
We have some questions on diet in general. One person wants to know, what's your opinion on taking probiotics?
Susie, I don't know if you want to answer that so that you can be part of the discussion as well, since I believe that would be appropriate.
Well, thanks for pulling me in, Alessio. I can say what I say you might say. But before we jump to that, I just wanted to add a little bit about thanking all the contributors to the book, because when we started on this, so I'm going to digress a bit, Polly, if that's okay. When we started this journey, we were approached and together we said, well, who can we pull in to help us learn about all this stuff? And we did. And we had a fantastic group of contributors, which as you go through the book, you'll learn about it. But the probiotics is still kind of an open question from what I can see, and that if you get what you need from your diet, that is where you need to really head to focus on your diet in terms of your well. And the Mediterranean diet is a great one in terms of the probiotics in your diet. So I'll toss it back to Alessio.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I'm pretty sure that in the future, when we understand a little bit more, we will be able to customize a specific probiotic for this specific dysbiosis, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, and the story by John Vanderhoof in section 3 is a wonderful discussion about probiotics and how that industry started. So it gives you a lot of background on that.
You mentioned the Mediterranean diet. We had someone ask if the Mediterranean diet is recommended for Crohn's disease.
So actually, interesting that this person mentioned that, because as everybody knows, if you're newly diagnosed with a chronic inflammatory disease like Crohn's disease, the first thing that you want to do is to quiet the inflammation and using steroids. And then followed immediately by biologics that now are the next generation of anti-inflammatory drug. But when you go after the inflammation, you go after the consequence and not the cause of this inflammatory process. Because we don't know what makes people sick with Crohn's, and therefore we are forced to focus on the consequences. Like that you have, pneumonia, and you take Tylenol, the fever will go away. So the consequence of the infection, i.e. the fever, will be controlled, but the cause will be still there. And when the effective Tylenol is gone, the fever will come back. Why? Because you were not able to eradicate the cause. Now, one thing that we understand about Crohn's, like many other conditions, is a consequence of inappropriate microbiome exposure in the gut, because Crohn's is an inflammation in the gut, that will respond in an exaggerated way to the presence of this microorganism in the gut. The vast majority of us live, again, in a friendly relationship, quieting down a possible inflammatory process instigated by the presence of microorganisms. We people with Crohn's can't do that. Well, now the first line of intervention for Crohn's disease is a diet. It's what we call elemental diets, that is the same efficacy in controlling inflammation, no side effects, of course. And what this diet does, change the microbiome composition. It's not sustainable over time because it's a very restricted diet, but it's enough to, as a first step to quiet down inflammation. In the long run, if I have to say if the Mediterranean diet is good to control the, Crohn's disease, hard to say, because again, Crohn's is the final destination. How you got there depends about individual and other. But if I have to say, it would be better to eat, a fast food diet versus a Mediterranean diet. There is no question that the fast food is much more pro-inflammatory, because not only shaped the microbiome, but also because it has elements in there that are pro-inflammatory, while the Mediterranean diet not only shapes the right microbiome, but there are some anti-inflammatory properties in some fruits, in some vegetables, in olive oil, in fish, that per se can quiet, the inflammatory process. So that's, again, you're gonna have much more in the book on this topic, but just to give it a snapshot.
What about a plant-based vegan diet? Somebody wanted to know.
Okay, well, again, I'm also a professional nutrition, and I have to say I respect any kind of diet that you like to embrace. The rule of the thumb is that the more you depart from the evolutionary plan of our diet, the more we make a disservice to us. So if you open your mouth and you look at your teeth, you immediately understand you were omnivores. We need to eat fruits, vegetable, meat, fish, everything. And if you allow me a comparison that is kind of reductive, so I apologize for the puristic on the call here. Imagine the microbiome as a farm in which you have cows, sheep, rabbits, chicken, horses, and so on and so forth. They eat different stuff. To keep the farm balanced in their animal composition, you do feed them all. That's the reason why we have to have an omnivore diet. When we push to the limits, so let's say plant-based diets, of course, we give advantage to some folks that will be still fed, but others will starve and disappear. And there is a rule that we know already that a poorly diversified portfolio of microorganisms in our microbiome is always bad news. We want as diversified, microbiome as possible. So that's just why, the Mediterranean diet is the typical, omnivore diet. So, well, how this differs from the, Western fast food diet? Well, because the proportion of the food has been changing. In the Mediterranean diet, there is a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetable, a lot of nuts, and lots of tubers. Why? Because when we were hunters-gatherers, fruits, vegetables, they are there. They don't run. So you just pick. Animals, you have to catch them. Very difficult. Rare. But when you got it, you got an animal that's lean because it's escaping predators, so it doesn't have too much fat, doesn't have antibiotics or hormones in their body for sure. And, but you eat rarely that. And this was the case, and it's still the case in some rural, poor countries in which, noble food is rare because it's too expensive. And they live on, again, proteins and vitamins that comes from, vegetables in general, with a scarce amount of stuff coming from meat, fish, and so on and so forth. This is a long way to answer. A balanced diet is always the best thing for your microbiome.
Okay, we had a couple questions about the microbiome and your relationship to your mother. So someone asked, how does a faulty microbiome in a mother, like a mother who has allergies, celiac, influence a child's microbiome, assuming vaginal delivery?
Yeah, actually, I have to say even more provocative, not only vaginal delivery, because there is a chapter, maybe that, Susie wants to step in this as well, that, question if, the implants of the microbiome starts in utero through the placenta microbiome and so on and so forth. And I will let, Susie eventually to expand on that. But clearly, if mom is a smoker or lives in a polluted area, eats, junk food and so on and so forth, her microbiome is not the ideal. And when it's time to engraft the microbiome through vaginal delivery, the kids will be exposed to an unbalanced microbiome. And we know, for example, that kids that they born by mother, they're overweight, for example. They tend to be overweight, not only because there's a genetic predisposition for that, but because they're engrafted with the composition of the microbiome that metabolically skew them towards obesity. So for the prenatal microbiome, I don't know if Susie, you want to add anything else with that?
Well, there in I think it's chapter 3 where we go into the idea of vaginal seeding of the baby after they're born with the mother's microbiome in the fluids for children that are cesarean delivered. children who come through, who don't come through the birth canal, and a pretty controversial topic in terms of whether that's a good practice or not. And there's some experts on both sides that have conflicting information on that. So and you have to have it cleared by the, it's not an easy thing to do. So that's an interesting discussion as well. And it brings up the whole concept of how, as you get deeper into the microbiome, it seems like you're going in deeper and you're learning all these smaller things, but they're all related to this really broad concept of that we are this interwoven fabric, not just in our own bodies, but in the society we live in. And for me, writing the book, that's kind of the overriding point, that we do not exist in a vacuum, and what we put in our mouths and what we wear, what we speak, what we do, it's all connected. So that was a beautiful piece for me in writing this book, which is digressing from the prenatal and the postnatal, but yeah.
Well, someone did ask, on hearing some of these cesarean section babies are being inoculated with birth fluids in an effort to perhaps stave off later obesity.
Yeah, this is what, Susie was alluding to, that we have, again, I'm not an OBGYN, nor is Susie, and we had to, base our opinion on what we read in the literature, but also we say, we contact experts, and as Susie was saying, there are two schools of thoughts. The ones that they say, you know what, yeah, if you are, for medical reasons that I believe absolutely legit, you have to, deliver your baby by C-section, you can mitigate the lack of passage of the birth canal by taking vaginal swabs and inoculating the mouth of the neonate so that it will be engrafted as it was passing through the canal. There is another school of thought that said, well, even if that would be the case, and it's not proved yet, according to this other school of thoughts, there is always the increased risk that you pass also, venereal infections. So we don't recommend that. So the jury is still out there. If that's the case or not, practice this way, and we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But again, I really do believe that the engraftment is important. But the engraftment, it doesn't stop with the passage of vaginal canal or by a vaginal swab. We have a line of research in our lab, and many others are doing the same, in which we try to understand if the breast milk microbiome has a role in continuing this engrafting is shaping. The microbiome in the first year of life, it seems to be totally chaotic, but it's an ordered chaos because, again, it's dating. We're trying to find each other, and we make some mistakes during this dating, and then we decide, oh, you will be useful for me to stay, you do not, and everything quiets down, the first 2 years of life, and will become the mature adult microbiome. So that the reason why I was saying the first 1,000 days of life, it's extremely important. It doesn't stop just with engraftment at birth. It's also the rest. What you feed your baby, how often you give him or her antibiotics. Again, what kind of hygiene you implement. It's so exaggerated and so on and so forth. Do you have pets home? Do you have other siblings that go to daycare? There are a lot of elements that can really help to shape the proper microbiome. Mother Nature took 2 million years to do this plan. The more we intervene, the more there's a chance that we do something wrong. If we just let Mother Nature do its course, it's always the best thing to do.
Okay, so we're at the mother's microbiome and babies. Let's skip. Somebody said, we'll go all the way to the end about aging. Someone said, read something recently that there appears to be changes in the gut biome that are positive for aging individuals. Can you expand on that?
Well, like anybody that writes a romance would not spoil what is the content in the book to know who was the assassin or whatever. So you got to read it. There's an entire chapter dedicated to aging. I found, for purpose, reasons, very fascinating, because unfortunately I'm getting there. And, aging is irreversible, non-negotiable, deterioration of a process of biology. And again, you can talk about, cellular aging, metabolic aging, organ aging, individual aging, social aging, mental aging, you name it. But once again, no matter what kind of aging you are dealing with, there is predictable shift in the microbiome that change some of the interchangeable mutually influencing function, the most important being gut permeability. Because the aging is nothing else, a process in which the building and destruction of elements, let's say cells, that happen from birth to death, in which you kill a certain number of cells that are inflamed, but you're able to subsidize with other the healthy cells so until you reach the steady state. So we, for example, change the entire layer of the intestine every week. So no matter how old are you, the intestine is 1 week old. The bones, even when we're adults, seems to be just a done deal. No, they are extremely dynamic. So there is cells that build the bones and cells that destroy the bones. And therefore, if you don't have the blocking elements to build that, you develop what we call osteoporosis, so fragile bones. Why? Because it's extremely dynamic. In aging, what happened that you have an increased destruction of cells and a decreased capability to regenerate. So the steady state goes imbalance, 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 imbalance until you reach a tilting point on no return. And it looks like that the composition of microbiome influenced tremendously this balance, because influence also the gut permeability and therefore antigen trafficking of noxious elements from the environment that instigate inflammation. Inflammation, it brings to cell death. So you have this increase until you get to the point in which you can't repair anymore. So, for example, a single experiment in fruit fly, in which the prediction when this fruit fly would die, it's much more closely related to the microbiome controlling gut permeability than the chronological age of the fruit fly. If you change the gut permeability of these animals, you double their life expectancy. So it's like that rather to live in 80 years, we can live 160 years if we just manipulate the microbiome so the gut permeability does not increase with aging. I find this fascinating.
How can we determine if we have an underlying inflammation?
Oh, well, first and foremost, clinically speaking, it's pretty obvious if you have inflammation or not. If you, the laundry list, it's extremely long, but, if you're always tired, if you have joint pain, if you have, skin rash, if your GI tract doesn't work well, if you're exposed very frequently to, flu-like symptoms, you're more susceptible to infections. Those are the key elements that clinically is telling you something is wrong. And of course, there are objective ways to do that. So there are biomarkers in your blood that will tell you there is a start of inflammation. There are chemicals that we call cytokines and chemokines that are increased when you have inflammation. The immune cells are all wrapped up and doing, belligerent stuff, and it's also measurable by a series of tests. And the list goes on and on and on. But who has a state of inflammation? Trust me, you would know, because if you're healthy, you're energetic. You are doing well, you don't have any pain, your function, your body is like, pristine and so on and so forth. So it's pretty obvious when something goes wrong.
Should we question broad spectrum antibiotics?
So any intervention that we do on our body is always a cost-benefit ratio. So if I have a meningitis and I'm going to die if I don't do anything, a broad spectrum antibiotics is absolutely a must, because the return on investment is such that you don't care if, in the short and medium term, that would disturb your microbiome. You would not exist if you don't intervene, because you're going to succumb to the infection. But when you have, a 1 or 2 years old kids with the recurrent fevers, and we know already that 90% of these fevers are due to viral infection, and we give antibiotics, either because we believe that the infection is due to a bacterium, or because you say, well, yeah, I know that it's viral, but I want to make sure that I protect these kids for a possible super infection with a microorganism like bacteria that can intervene on a you know, a susceptible body. Then that would do a disservice. Because of course, you know, antibiotics, particularly unprospective antibiotics, is like a bombshell on a community. That would be wiped up. It would take weeks and weeks to establish the status quo. So I will be very conservative and you know, use them only when I absolutely need it.
Okay, we have time for maybe a few more questions. Someone said, how long does it take to turn an unhealthy gut microbiome into a healthy one?
It depends on your lifestyle. You know, if you want the easy fix, take the probiotics and I'm going to fix that. It's going to take a long time, if will happen. You know, if on the other hand, you eat well, you sleep well, you have a good, you know, sleep hygiene, you again try to minimize the level of stress, you laugh to yourself and the others so that you don't take life too seriously. You keep exercising, and exercise doesn't mean that you have to run the marathon. If you do 6,000-7,000 steps a day, it will be more than enough. Again, I can go on and on and on. The chance that you switch the microbiome in the right direction is extremely high. Find that the symbiotic relationship, again, it's a matter of having your body give the opportunity to chase the friendly microbiome for you. The more we have a lifestyle that impede that searching each other in that sweet, again, friendly relationship, the more there is a chance that something will go wrong.
Okay, we'll do one. I want to finish it up with one more question. And this probably just, you know, goes right into what you were saying, but somebody wants to know the first steps to alter our behavior, but and then somebody else, how has your own diet and lifestyles changed as you have learned more? So yeah. Tell us all how we can get started with that.
I was born and raised in Italy, in a spot a few miles from where the Mediterranean diet that was, you know, an intuition of an American physiologist, you know, realized looking at this ultra-centenary individual living nearby, really where I was born and raised, and he wondered what they are doing right that we're not doing. And again, he came up with this Mediterranean diet concept and so on and so forth, including lifestyle. So I personally, my wife and I, we take great joy in cooking, because, you know, we don't eat anything that we don't prepare ourselves. So we know what we put in our tank, so to speak. I know that, you know, the lifestyle, today's lifestyle is we live in a fast lane of life. And we think, you know, if I go to the supermarket and I buy the trail that I just put in the microwave and heat for 20 minutes, you know, I will be able to put food on the table and yet work and do the other stuff and exercise and go, you know, doing my stuff and so on and so forth. There is nothing far from truth. If you organize yourself by doing the right food shopping and so on and so forth, you can cook in 20 minutes a good meal, and you choose what, you know, you put on your table. That would be my stronger recommendation, most than anything else. Plus, cooking is relaxing, it's bonding, help, you know, it's creative because you follow the recipe, then you put your own spin on that. You know, more than once, Susie and I have been having these kind of gatherings when we were allowed to, in which we cook together. And again, it's a great, you know, natural experiment in which the entire family is involved. Now that we're being in lockdown, I know that most of us have been adventuring in cooking and so on and so forth. I hope that when this is all said and done, we will continue with that attitude because, you know, there is nothing best but take care of our body. There is nothing more pressured to make sure that, again, by really knowing what we know right now, and again, we were totally naive about this microbiome situation. If you read this book and just you got out of that the sense of how can I respect my body, How can I respect the environment that I live? How am I respect the people that they think different than I do, but still, I can engage in a respectful relationship with these people. And therefore, we don't make the quote unquote fake news that, global warming does not exist, or we do not have any kind of impact when you use chemicals, to grow crops, because the large corporation now, this is what we do. We will not have an impact. If we just think just very carefully about all this, I believe that we will have a much better world going forward. Last generation, for the first time, end up to have a life expectancy lower than the previous generation. That never happened in evolution of humankind. The goal of this book is to really give a testimony of what we can do so that, the next generation can again live a better and longer life, living an environment and an attitude that will bring us back to not the cave, because that's not the goal, but that kind of lifestyle, respecting each other, the environment, that will make us in a much better world.
Well, that was a great way to end. I want to thank you, Alessio and Susie, for being here tonight, taking time out of your, I'm sure, very busy schedules. We really appreciate it. A reminder to our audience again, if you'd like to purchase the book, the link for the purchase is in the chat window, and it's also available at the Learned Owl website. So thank you, everybody, and good night.